Understanding God's Plan, Lesson 15. We have gone through from the creation, from Adam and Eve and the Abrahamic covenant, all the way into the nation of Israel becoming a nation and carrying the birthright. And so we've gotten to the end. We've been through the time of the judges and the kings and so on, hopefully trying to fit everything together, how all this has fit into God's plan, what God had planned from the beginning, and what the Abrahamic covenant had to do with who Jesus is. So we've gotten to the point between the Old Testament and the New Testament writings, there's about a 400-year period of time. So tonight, we're going to do history, geography, and genealogies. Doesn't that sound exciting? Because I think we need to do that to get us to where we need to be. Because when you're reading the Bible, that blank period of time, unless you read history and Josephus, Tacitus, the Maccabees, first, second Maccabees, gives you some history along in between there that's good history. First, second Maccabees, third and fourth Maccabees is superstition. It's not really history, but first and second Maccabees is pretty much historically accurate from what I can see, because it matches up with what Tacitus wrote and what Josephus wrote, so it must be fairly close to right. So we're going to talk about that particular period of time. In order to do that, I'm going to start out with two maps that I used last week or week before last actually. And the two maps are, this one is Israel at the time when the 12 tribes came from Egypt and they settled in the land, the promised land. And it shows each one of the tribes and where they settled and so on, right on through the time of Joshua into the time of the judges. And it didn't change much from this through the time of the judges, which is about a 400 and some year period of time. Then I have this map that shows you a difference. This was at the time of King David and King Solomon, the way Israel looked. And this one is for frame of reference here. You can see that this is the Dead Sea, this is the Sea of Galilee. Well, here this is the Dead Sea, this is the Sea of Galilee. And you can see where the nation of Israel ended. And under David and into Solomon's time, the kingdom increased all the way up to the Euphrates River and all the way down to the Sinai Peninsula down here. And you can see it stopped just about here before, and this was all added to it. And so that's where the kingdom under David was. Now I'm going to show some maps, bring one up into modern time just to give us a point of reference, and I've gotten tied up in my cord here. This is a map showing how Palestine looked, Israel looked at the time that Jesus walked the earth. And you can see you have Galilee up here. Right here's Nazareth, where Jesus was raised. Sea of Galilee. And then you have Samaria and you have Judea. You know, when you read about the woman of Samaria and so on, if you don't look at maps and things, you don't get any perspective, because this area is where Jesus spent most of his time in ministry, but he would come down to Jerusalem from time to time. You read about that. Well, he had to pass through Samaria, so it's not unusual that he would be talking to Samaritan people from time to time, because they didn't have very high-speed transportation, and mostly it was right foot and your left foot, and that's the way most of the travel was done. Not many of them rode. Most of them, you see them on the movies, you see them riding camels and things like that, but most people didn't. They walked. So you can see where Galilee, Samaria, Judea, and then Perea, and this is the tetrarchy of Philip. And you say, we'll get to that in just a minute. I wanted to bring it up a little bit to get to show you the history of Israel as a nation into modern times. And this is the UN partition plan in 1947. Israel became a nation in 1948. And this is the partition plan that the UN proposed. And the blue area you see is is Israel. And the green area is proposed land for Arabs. And you can see down here, this is Gaza. Up here is where the Golan Heights is, up here between Syria. And over here is Jordan. And this area here, you can see, is right up, backs right up to the Jordan River, up next to Jordan. Then, as you move up to 1949, 1967, Jordan took over this territory that was for the Arabs, so they were actually part of Jordan for all intents and purposes. I've said before in this course and different courses that there never has been a nation of Palestine. They're talking about a Palestinian nation. Well, there never has been a nation of Palestine. The whole area, all of that area, Israel, all the way up to Syria, and all was called there. It was Palestine. It was, I think it was the Romans first called it Palestine, and they think it came because the Philistines, the land of Philistia, was down here, and they called the area Palestine. So Palestine never was a nation, and some people say that this is should be a Palestinian nation again. Well, it never has been. I'm not saying whether it should be or whether it shouldn't be. I'm just saying this is just facts. And so up until 1967, Jordan had control of that particular area. Then, in 1967, June the 10th, it looked like this because we had what they called the 6 Days War, where Egypt and Syria and Jordan and different Arab countries decided they were going to wipe Israel out, and it didn't work well. In 6 days, Israel had beat all them back, and if this, don't hold me to these numbers, but Israel lost like 1,000 men in that 6 days, and the Arab countries around them lost like 10 to 20,000 men. So I mean, they got severely beaten by the Israelis in that time, and that's when Israel took possession of this land from Jordan, and that's the reason they call that the occupied territory. They also took the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt because Egypt had attacked them, and the Gaza Strip, and they took the Golan Heights from Syria to use as buffers between them. And have you ever seen any video footage or pictures or anything from the Golan Heights? If you're sitting up on the Golan Heights and you're looking, you can look right down into Israel. It's easy to shoot rockets and missiles and shells and stuff off the Golan Heights over into there. So Israel put an end to that by occupying that territory and annexing it so that they can use that to protect themselves from Syria. Now just think about how in fact, I'll show you a picture here. See what I've got next. This gives you an idea. This is Israel today. This is the occupied territory you're just talking about. This is Gaza, and that's the Golan Heights. Look at all the Arab countries around Israel and how little Israel is in between all those, and none of them like Israel. Now, they've signed peace treaties with Egypt, and that's the reason Egypt has the Sinai Peninsula now, because when Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat came together and signed a peace treaty, they got this Sinai Peninsula back. They gave that back as part of the deal, but they kept the Gaza Strip. And just a couple of years ago, all the Israelis pulled out of Gaza, and as soon as they did, Hamas and different groups started shooting missiles out of Gaza into Israel. So it didn't really work out well for them. So you can see how Israel, through all of these the changes they went through in modern times, but this was the way it was when Jesus walked the earth. And that was what was important, is getting the covenant with Abraham was important, because that's the reason that the Jews are God's chosen people, is because God made a covenant with Abraham, and Abraham was the first Jew, and it was through him that the birthright was passed down through the nation of Israel. Without that birthright, we wouldn't have had the Messiah. We wouldn't have had Jesus without that birthright. And so it was carried through the nation. So you can see how God worked to protect that nation in spite of them. And I said the last time we were together talking about the kings of Israel and Judah, because the kingdom split after King Solomon died, and Rehoboam and Jeroboam took over the two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. They went through like 39 kings. And out of the 39, there was maybe 4 good kings out of all of them for all those years. And yet God still protected them and kept them in existence to get Jesus into the world. That brings us up to where we are now. We're going to look at a timeline. Now, these dates that you see over here are not exact. I put them in there to get us so you can get an idea of where we are. Because years ago, we went to a homeschool convention when our kids were small. And I think it was the Konos method of teaching history, world history. And the method, I had never thought about it like this. The way this lady did that came up with this curriculum, she had a timeline and she had a spot in the middle and said, this is Jesus. And then we teach history back from Jesus this way and forward from Jesus this way. And that way you put it in perspective. Because when we study history and right on through high school and any courses I've ever taken in history, you'll study some over here, you'll study some over here, you'll study some over, but you don't see perspective, how it all fits together. And once you see how it fits together, then it makes more sense, or it does to me. So if it doesn't to you, then just take a nap and we'll be done here in a few minutes. 1000 BC, these dates are BCE because I took this off of a chart, and that means before the Common Era. We believe we go BC, that's before Christ. So anyway, 1000 BC, King David conquered Jerusalem. Once he conquered Jerusalem, he made that the capital of the nation of Israel. 960 BC, David's son King Solomon built the first temple. So that was 960 years before, or almost 1,000 years, probably 1,000 years before Jesus was crucified. Then in 721 BC, the Assyrians conquered Samaria. Remember I talked about the northern kingdom was split from the southern kingdom. Well, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom at this particular time and took them into captivity and intermingled with them and destroyed and did away with the nation for all intents and purposes. Then in 568 BC, the Babylonian forces under Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar I was his grandfather, but Nebuchadnezzar II is the one that we read about in the book of Daniel when we're reading about what he was taken into captivity under Nebuchadnezzar. It doesn't say Nebuchadnezzar II, but that's who it was. I know that from history. So anyway, he came in and he demolished the city pretty much, destroyed it, and tore down the temple. And you'll know from reading the book of Daniel that he took the captives in, took Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah with their Jewish names. He took them into captivity along with many more of the inhabitants. That was 586 BC. In 539 BC, the Persian ruler Cyrus conquered Babylon. And you read about that in the book of Daniel as well, when, Daniel's Babylonian name was Belteshazzar, I think, and Belshazzar was the ruler in the Bible that you read about. He had a party and called for the utensils of the temple to be brought in, the Jewish temple, and they drank out of them, they partied, and all this kind of stuff. And the kingdom, remember there was a handwriting on the wall, that's where we get the expression, the handwriting on the wall. But you see all that, but the Babylonian Empire, as powerful as it was, fell in one night because the Persian troops, there was a river that ran underneath the city that brought water into the city. They just dammed it up and walked through under the walls and conquered the city. So that's what happened with them. Then in 516, Cyrus, it wasn't just with the Jews, it was other people. He had a policy of religious freedom to a large degree, and he agreed with Ezra. You get to the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther is what they call the post-exilic books. In other words, these three books were where you came back from the exile, or while they were in exile, is when those books occurred, what happened to those. So this is Ezra went to King Cyrus, and he got permission to go back, and Ezra financed the trip and sent them letters to tell the people around them, don't bother them, let them do what they want to do, and they built the second temple, which was not near as grand as the first one, but they built the second temple. Then if you'll see down in 445, 425 BC, Nehemiah, And in our Bibles, we have Ezra and Nehemiah. In the Jewish Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah is one book. And he came back and he rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. Now, what I want us to think about through all this is look at what God is doing, what He's going through in order to have His people where they needed to be for Jesus to be born as a Jew and be born under the Abrahamic covenant in the land that He said He'd be born in. 332 BC, the Greek leader Alexander the Great conquered Judea and Jerusalem and all anything that he could conquer, he conquered. By the time he was 33 years old, he had conquered the whole world as far as he knew, and wound up dying in a drunken stupor at 33 years old. And he had his four top generals. The kingdom was divided between them, and there was a couple more too, but there was only four major ones, and it was Ptolemy and Seleucid, and it was Cassander and Lysimachus, but I don't have anything on them in here because that doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. So in 332 through 141 BC, the Ptolemaics and the Seleucids were in rule in Jerusalem. Sometimes one would rule, sometimes the other would rule. It would go back and forth. So I got us another map. I told you we'd be doing geography. I don't know if you can see much from that. This is where Israel is, the Mediterranean Sea, and Israel's in here. This was the Seleucid kingdom, and this was the Ptolemaic kingdom. You'll notice they joined together about where Israel is. And that created a lot of conflict, a lot of problems for the Jewish people. Because of these two kingdoms. I was taking an Old Testament Bible course, and I won't say the guy's name. He had a doctorate in theology, and he was talking about this particular period in history. And he said, and then there was Antiochus III's daughter, Cleopatra. He said, you've read about Cleopatra, Antony and Cleopatra. And when he said that, I was thinking, he's 150 years off. This guy has a PhD in theology, and he doesn't know, and in history, and he doesn't know he's 150 years off. There was about 7 Cleopatras. Cleopatra the first was a princess of the Seleucid Empire, and he married her off to Ptolemy the Fifth, I think it was, to try to create peace between the two regions. It didn't work. And in fact, if you follow the bloodline and the lineage of the Ptolemaics in Egypt, through that they married brothers, married sisters, uncle married nieces. I mean, it was, and you might have one that would marry 2 of his sisters, and so it was a strange time. But that's what was going on in this particular area through that time. And to put it in perspective, this is the Seleucid Empire. Down here is the Ptolemaic Empire. But look who's over here. This beginning to gain some momentum at that particular time. The Roman Empire was beginning to gain some strength. The reason I bring that up is because the next thing we're going to get to it is the Hasmonean period in Israel's history. The Seleucids, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, decided he was going to conquer the Ptolemaic Empire. So he takes his army and he marches through Jerusalem and he marches all the way down. He gets almost to Alexandria. And when he gets there, I forgot which Roman general it is, but there's a Roman general there that meets him when he gets there. And the Roman general says, you have a choice. You can go back home and not do this, or if you want to fight with them, you've picked a war with me too. So the Romans are going to fight against you as well. And Antiochus Epiphanes said, well, let me think about it. So the general takes his staff and draws a circle around him and says, you have to make up your mind before you step out of that circle. period. He said, I think I'll go back home. So he heads back home. Now, what does this have to do with Jerusalem? He's ticked off. Antiochus Epiphanes is ticked off. He gets to Jerusalem, and these Jews have been rebellious and been giving him a hard time anyway. So he decides that he's going to teach them a lesson. So he goes into the temple, throws everything out, sets up an altar to Zeus, and sacrifices a pig on the altar. That doesn't make the Jews happy. That was about 167 BC. And the Hasmonean period starts 141 to 37 BC. They won that, in fact, Hanukkah, that the Jews celebrate today with the 8 candles. That was because of what happened under the Maccabees when, about 167, I think it is, when they actually beat the Seleucid army and kicked them out of Jerusalem. And when they're supposed to have the lamps burning in the temple 24 hours a day, every day of the week, and they only had enough oil to burn one day. And it would take 8 days before they'd have any more, but by miracle, they say, it burned for 8 days until they could get a fresh supply of oil, and that's the reason they celebrate Hanukkah to this day. It has to do with what happened during this particular period with the Maccabees. But it was 140 from 167 to 141. At 141, before they actually gained independence and became an independent nation again, and it stayed that way up until 37 BC. 63 BC is when the Roman general Pompey captured Jerusalem. And if you remember, see if I get it, yeah. The Herodian period, 37 to 70. 37, King Herod restores the second temple. He restored the temple bigger and better than it ever had been. Built the Temple Mount that we see today in Jerusalem with the Dome of the Rock on it, the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. We see all that up there today. That's where, we're quite sure that was the Temple Mount. But he built all of that walled-in area and restored the temple that they had rebuilt, and it took him years to get it done. Then in 30, Jesus was crucified by the Romans in Jerusalem. Now, 70, after Jesus was crucified in about 30, I say roughly 30 BC, AD. Did I say BC? It's AD. This says CE, which means Common Era, but we go by AD. What does AD mean? Nope. That's what everybody thinks. It's Anno Domini. Anno Domini, which is an Latin phrase, which means in the year of our Lord. Is what it means. So but everybody thinks it's after death. That's a lot easier for us than Anno Domini. I can't hardly say it. So anyway, 70, we would say AD, is when you remember Jesus told them that the temple there wouldn't be one stone left upon another? That actually occurred. There was not one. They took every stone from the temple and threw it off the side of the Temple Mount, and it was flat. There was nothing there. Then 135 AD, Jerusalem rebuilt as a Roman city. Now, I've got this chart, and I was trying to decide whether to include this or not, but when you're talking about the historical era around the time of Jesus and at the time of the New Testament, you read about King Herod. Well, that was not just one man. When you're talking about Herod the Great was the one who was there that's the one the wise men went to. It's the one that sent and had the innocents killed. That was that particular King Herod. But he died shortly after that. And you remember the angel told Joseph to get Jesus and Mary and take off to Egypt because the king was about to have them killed. And then while they were in Egypt, they had been in Egypt for a while, and he said, the king has died, Herod has died, you can return back to Israel. And on the way, he realized that his son, which Archelaus, was the one that was in power, so instead of going to Bethlehem, he went to Nazareth, and that's the way Jesus wound up being raised in Nazareth. He went to Nazareth instead of back to Bethlehem, where he had left from to go to Egypt. There was 4 of these, and what Herod had done, he was the last one that was called King of the Jews because it was divided up into, and each one of these were called tetrarchs. You had tetrarchs, and you had ethnarchs, which were below the tetrarchs. But anyway, that means there were 4 of them, and this was who they were. And in Matthew 2:22 is where you see where he had told Joseph, when Joseph realized that he was on the throne after his father, Herod the Great, and so that's when he turned and went to Nazareth. That's in Matthew 22. Then when you talk about Herod Antipas, he was a tetrarch. It says every gospel reference except for Luke 1-2 and Matthew 2, when it says Herod, that's who it's talking about, but otherwise it's talking about the other one. And then you have Philip over here, and then Aristobulus is the other one that you don't read as much about. Then we come down to here, and you have Herodias, who was Philip's wife, who became Antipas's wife. Why is that significant? John the Baptist said that he talked bad about him, and he got arrested and had his head cut off because of this sweet lady here. Herodias didn't like it because she said, he can't talk about us like that. So anyway, then you have Herod Agrippa the first, which is every time in Acts except for 4:27 and 13:1, when it says Antipas, this is the one that is talking about King Agrippa. Then the Herod Agrippa the second down here, every Acts reference to Agrippa, chapters 25-26. Then you have Bernice, the wife of Agrippa II, and Drusilla, the wife of Governor Felix, which you read about in Acts 24:24. So if you don't have to memorize all that, but that's just to let you know that there were several different Herods and several different ones, and when they refer to one, it was not necessarily the one you were thinking it was. If that helps find. Now we're going to do something really exciting. We're going to do the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew 1:1, the historical record of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. You notice how Matthew starts his writing. He says, the historical record of Jesus Christ, the son of David, puts him in the Davidic line, and the son of Abraham. So he's of the covenant people, God's chosen people. He's under this particular. If there had never been a covenant made with Abraham, we wouldn't have had Jesus, not in the way we did, because the reason the Jews are God's chosen people, because Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. So it was under this covenant. So what he's saying, and I would read it like, he's a descendant of David, and he's also under the Abrahamic covenant. And this is the genealogical record. Abraham fathered Isaac, Isaac fathered Jacob, Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and that's in the 38th chapter of Genesis. You can read about this is Judah's daughter-in-law who had those 2 children of his. It's a long story. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Aram. Aram fathered Abinadab, and we could write on down. You see the one you recognize here. It said fathered Boaz by Rahab. You recognize Rahab? In the King James, it said Rahab the harlot is the way it describes her. And it says Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth, and Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered King David. So you can see the lineage all the way down. It's tracking Jesus through the Davidic line. From David to the Babylonian exile, it says David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife. Solomon fathered Rehoboam. Rehoboam, right on down, it follows down to Uzziah, fathered Jotham. Jotham fathered Ahaz. Ahaz, Hezekiah. Hezekiah, Manasseh, so on down to here. And Josiah fathered Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. In other words, that goes all the way down to the time of Babylon, is where it's carrying the lineage of Jesus in the book of Matthew. Then it has from the exile where they came back, that we talked about earlier here. Then after the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah followed. It goes through all the different ones, Zerubbabel, and say that one real fast. Zerubbabel fathered, but it tells all who they fathered right on down. And then it goes down to Eliezer, all the way down. And Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Okay, where did it start, the genealogy? It started with Abraham. We're not done. So take a breath. The genealogy of Jesus Christ in the book of Luke. Some people, many theologians believe that the genealogy in Luke is actually the genealogy of Mary. It's not the genealogy of Joseph. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But there's a few names that's a little bit different because it follows a different branch of the family than it does under the one in Matthew. But this starts with Jesus and backs up. It says, as he began his ministry, Jesus was about 30 years old and was thought to be the son of Joseph. And that phrase, when they look at it, is one reason they think this was actually the genealogy of Mary. And it could be. So it follows all the way down, son of Joseph, and it down to here. And then we go down to Mattathias, all the way down to son of Levi, son of Simeon, son of Judah, son of Joseph, you notice they name through the generations, they have family names. My Brown side, my grandmother was a Brown. The Brown side of the family, my great-grandfather was named Ephraim. And my uncle is Floyd Ephraim. And all through that Brown side of the family, you'll find the name Ephraim pop up because they named him after him. And the same thing occurs here. You see the same names apply over and over again. And then down, son of Perez, son of Judah, the one I talked about before. Son of Perez, son of Judah, son of Jacob, son of Isaac, son of Abraham. This is where we started in Matthew. Look what Luke is doing. Son of Terah, son of Nahor, son of Serug. It goes all the way down. Son of Canaan, son of Enos, son of Seth, son of Adam, son of God. So in Luke's genealogy, he starts with God. And he calls Adam his son. What does John 3:16 say? He said his only begotten son. Well, here it calls Adam his son. Is the Bible wrong? You know the answer, but begotten means, I'm not going to try to pronounce it. Edna probably could. Yeah, well, she's not going to make us feel bad by doing it. Begotten, only, born, soul, only. So he was the only one that's born of God because God created Adam. Adam was the son created. Jesus was the only begotten, only born. Jesus was born of man and of God. Now, if you don't trust me on the meaning of that, you can look up that word and see if I'm right. But trust me, that's what it means. That is, if my concordances are right, that's what it means, because I don't speak Hebrew or Greek, so it doesn't help me much so far as that goes. But Adam was the son of God. In fact, why was it important and necessary for Jesus to be born of man? And then why was it important that Jesus be born of God? So that's our two questions to get us, because we're going to be talking about where Jesus comes into this when we get back next week. But why was it important that he be born son of man? Okay, that's good. What else? Why did he have to be born a descendant of Abraham? It's not marginal. It's not It's not he had to be. The covenant was made with Abraham. Abraham believed God, and he went through the whole process. The last test that Abraham had was that he had to sacrifice his son, and the Bible refers to him as his only son, but we know that was his second son. The first one was Ishmael, the second one was Isaac, but he referred to him, the scripture refers to him as he sacrificed, because Abraham sacrificed his only son. He set the precedence. He did each one of the steps that he had to do to ratify the covenant, so this covenant relationship had to come. Why didn't God just come down here and when Adam and Eve goofed up and just slapped them around a little bit and straightened them out? Now think about that. Why is it important that Jesus be born Son of God? In order for Jesus to do what he did, he had to be born of God, he had to be the Son of God, and he had to be the Son of Man. That wasn't an option. People say God chose to do it like that. God chose to do it like that for a specific reason. 1 Corinthians 15:45 says, "So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit." So it speaks of the first Adam and the second Adam. So we're talking about man. Who was created in the image of God, Adam or Eve? Both. In fact, if you read Genesis 1:28, it tells you that, or 1:27 and 28. It tells you that he was created. It says, in the image of God created he them. So in other words, the two of them, so God is not, you say, is God man or woman? Now people get upset about this. He's neither one. He's spirit, so he's not the same as we are, in case you hadn't noticed. If Jesus was only born of God, could he have legally paid the debt owed by man? And God gave the earth to man. In Genesis 1, he says, you subdue, you take authority, you take dominion. In other words, he gave this to him. He didn't say, now if you mess up, I'm taking it back. He gave it to him. So if God is, and a lot of people they don't like this term. If God was going to legally come into the earth and save man, he had to do it through man, because the authority on the earth was man. Because he gave it to him. He said, you take authority, you subdue. He didn't say, you're going to be ruling under me. He said, you subdue, you do this. What's the only thing he told him that he shouldn't do? Eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? He didn't tell him he couldn't. He said, every tree is made that you can eat any tree here you want to. This is Randy's translation. But if you know what's good for you, you're not going to eat from that tree over there. Tree of knowledge of good and evil, you're going to leave that alone. Don't eat from it, because on the day that you do, you'll surely die. So Jesus needed to come through man. God needed to come through man to save man, and he had to come in a legal way, because God doesn't do anything that's not legal. So he creates a covenant with Abraham, creates a birthright that's passed down all the way through Israel. So he's born into the seed of David and the seed of Abraham, and he's the Son of God and he's the Son of Man. He had to be the Son of God, because if he had just been born here a man, how many perfect men have you ever known? Tommy, how many perfect women have you ever known? He's not saying, it's real quiet. He's real quiet. They don't make perfect human beings. So if Jesus had to come here just as a man, he'd have been no different than anybody else. He came here as the Son of Man. That gave him legal authority to be here and to do what he did. And he came here as the Son of God, so he didn't have the sin nature and the nature that we have that makes us goof up and mess up all the time. Not that I mess up, because Dinah will tell you I'm perfect. If Jesus had only been born of man, could he have redeemed man and bought back what man had squandered? And the answer is no. Romans 8:6. For the mindset of the flesh is death, but the mindset of the Spirit is life and peace. For the mindset of the flesh is hostile to God because it does not submit itself to God's law, for it is unable to do so. It says it's unable to do so. It makes me feel better. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God, period. You, however, are not in the flesh but in the Spirit, since the Spirit of God lives in you. But if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he does not belong to him. Genesis 1:28 that I mentioned says, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. God became man. So because he was the owner of the earth, I put down here, that worked well as long as man did not abuse his power and authority, which he did. And man proved that he was not a good God. Adam and Eve basically, it always bothered me. I think, now why would God care about them eating from that tree? When they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they were saying, in essence, we don't need God as arbitrator of us, telling us what is good and what's evil. We can handle that ourselves. So they became, in essence, their own God. Man makes a poor God. Jesus was man, giving him authority here on the earth. Jesus was God, giving him the power and the authority to not be ruled over by sin nature that had plagued man ever since the fall. Any questions or comments?